Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 17, Section 3, Keynote Lecture. This is basically a description as to what happens in the South after the Radical Reconstruction Act of 1867, after the Radical Republicans take charge of Reconstruction, divide up the South into military districts, and basically strong-arm them into making sure that they accept and pass 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And so with this, you're going to see African Americans actually taking part, not just voting, but becoming part of the government. So no state in the South after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, there was no state that had an African American majority in the government. But during this time, you had 16 African Americans serve in the House and 2 served in the Senate. That is a great statement as to moving forward in the right direction. I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. Hiram Revels was a senator for Mississippi for 1 year. He was a former minister. He was a recruiter, a teacher, and a chaplain during the Civil War. And he said he was treated fairly in the Senate. Those were his reports. So Hiram Revels, former minister, senator for Mississippi. Another senator from Mississippi was Blanche K. Bruce. Blanche K. Bruce was a runaway slave, and after the Civil War, he became a senator for the state of Mississippi for 6 years. After that, he went on to become a superintendent of public schools and was very successful in his efforts. Now, during Reconstruction, you had Southern whites who were actually in favor of what the Republicans were doing in the South, with them trying to make sure that African Americans were getting new rights given to them. If you were a Southern white and you supported the Republicans, you were given some nicknames. One of them was a scalawag. A scalawag was a worthless rascal. So if you were a white person in the South who opposed secession, who supported the Republicans, you were a non-slave holding farmer or business leader, you were called a scalawag by the majority of the people around you. Now, another nickname for whites who lived in the South was carpetbaggers. Now, these were not people who were from the South. These were white people who lived in the North that moved to the South to help reshape the South in the quote-unquote image of the North. Now, this became a negative nickname because there were people that moved from the North to the South that were greedy, and they were trying to take advantage of the South's need. Now, there's always going to be people that want to take advantage of a situation, and this time of Reconstruction during the Civil War was no different. There was corruption involved in people who were trying to help. You're always going to have that group of people that just are greedy and try and take advantage. So, how did people who live in the South, how did they resist African American rights without completely breaking the amendments? Well, there's a few reasons. Some of them refused to let them leave the plantation. They said they had to keep working there. Some of them refused to rent land to African Americans. So you had all these plantation owners that had all this land. They couldn't afford to work all the land, and so this leads to a rental of parts of the land, and so a lot of them just refused to rent land based on race. Some store owners refused to let African Americans either work in stores or give them credit, and a lot of farmers worked on credit, especially if you were just starting up. So there's always going to be resistance. This starts right at the beginning of Reconstruction, not treating someone fairly just because of their race. Now, this actually leads to the establishing of the KKK. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the KKK. It's the Ku Klux Klan. It was founded in 1866. That's just 1 year after the Civil War started. It was begun by white people in the South who used this organization to intimidate African Americans and those who were for or supported African American rights in the South. They were known for their violence toward African Americans. It became very common. Obviously, they're known for what they wore, the white hood, so that people would not recognize them. They would burn homes and churches and schools, and many times it would lead to murder as well. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, they became very active right before elections. Now, you think, what would the KKK be trying to intimidate elections? They were trying to keep African Americans from voting for people who would support them. And so sometimes you might think, how does an organization like that, how does it keep going? How come they're not, put in prison? Well, unfortunately, laws against the Klan had little effect because basically Southern whites would be afraid to testify against them, because then their violence and their intimidation would be turned on them. And so it's just a vicious cycle of that type of situation. Okay, so let's talk about some improvements because, to try and finish with a positive. Education definitely improved for the better. During Reconstruction, you had 4,000 schools with 200,000 students. Half the teachers were African Americans. Public schools were created for both races in the South during the 1870s, and this is where segregation comes into play. Most schooling was segregated, so they had separate schools. Now, there were just a handful of states that did not. Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, they were integrated. Their schools had both whites and African Americans. So this is the beginning of segregation, which obviously gets a lot worse before it comes to an end. And then farming. Buying land was difficult for most African Americans, mostly because of the financial aspect of buying a land. But like I mentioned before, with all of that land that plantation owners had, they couldn't farm it all themselves, and they didn't have enough money to pay people to farm it. And so what they would do is they would rent land. This is where sharecropping comes into play. Basically, you would rent land and some supplies, and in return, you would give a percentage of your crops, what you would make off your crops, back to the landowner. So it's like renting part of a plantation so that you could make money, but then also the person who owned the land could also make money as well. So this is the end of section 3, and tomorrow we'll begin section 4, and it will be in 2 parts. So make sure you read the pages that are associated with this particular section. Thanks so much.